Hi, everybody. Welcome to our Hometime video series. Today, we're going to be discussing all things revenue management. We get a lot of questions in the business from homeowners who want to understand how we approach pricing, the strategies that sit behind the pricing, and why things are higher and lower, and what drives that. So we're obviously committed to being fully transparent in the way that we manage your property. And of course, we're working really hard all the time to maximize revenue through the property. So today on the call, well, I'll introduce myself first. My name is Billy Crock, if you haven't come across me. I'm one of the co-founders of Hometime and the CEO. Obviously been running the business for a long time, and we've been dreaming about pricing since day one. With me, I have Abs, who's our senior manager for revenue management. And he's been with the business for 5 years or more, and lots of experience in every market and, at all facets of the business. So a great person to have overseeing the revenue management team. And I've also got Dale Sutton with me, who's a senior revenue manager with a background in lots of sort of tourism and travel industries, doing pricing for tours and hotels and all sorts of things. So a really wide range of experience. So if we keep on rolling, I'll let the guys kind of introduce themselves, and then we'll kick off with some sections, I guess, of revenue management, and then we'll follow with a bit of Q&A at the end that I can lead. So I might pass over to Dale to give us a bit of a rundown of, I guess, the overall revenue management piece.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Billy. I'll talk you through some of, I guess, our key drivers for our pricing across, all our different properties and our different markets, and then hand over to Abs, who'll talk a bit more about our other settings around minimum stays and things like that. So, we do employ a dynamic pricing model at Hometime. So, that allows us to obviously tailor specific pricing based on demand, different days of the week, different times of year, during peak events and, quieter periods as well, and making sure that we're sort of ensuring we've got the most appropriate pricing for that market at the specific time of year. We do that in a various number of ways, which we'll talk to in the next couple of slides. We have specific customisations, which allows us to sort of tailor specific strategies or specific dynamic pricing strategies for those specific markets or that specific property, because obviously it does vary quite a lot between, one part of Australia to another, or one particular part of a city or a location to another part. So we can customise that as well. And we also do manual adjustments over like peak events and special events, and also low demand periods as well, like I mentioned before. So I guess these are breaking down sort of three fundamental pillars of our dynamic pricing strategy. So the first one is our market level customization. So these ones are hugely important. So it's essentially where we define what we think is the most relevant and important settings to apply for a particular market, and making sure that the algorithm that sits behind that behaves in a particular way. So obviously, like I mentioned, every market does behave differently. So it makes sense for us to make sure that we've got very specific settings in our market customizations that relate to that specific market accordingly. And for context, we have potentially up to 10 different customizations even within one actual market. So we don't just have one for one market, we have potentially multiple of those, which again break down in a more granular level what's most relevant to either a particular location or a group of properties in that market itself. The next pillar is the dynamic pricing algorithm that sort of drives that. So based on what we define in the market level customizations determines how the dynamic pricing algorithm behaves. And then we'll talk more about that in the next couple of slides, sort of what makes up that algorithm itself. But essentially the prices are set based on the market level customizations that we set, that then determines the impact of those specific metrics in the algorithm itself. And then the third one is manual overrides and adjustments that we make as a revenue management team. So whilst we rely heavily on our defined customizations and then the algorithm that drives that, we also create overrides and adjustments that we think are appropriate for particular times of year. And that's super relevant for times like, ultra peak periods and events, which happens right around Australia. There's pretty much no market that doesn't have some type of ultra peak period or event. So we kind of, make our own assessments and adjustments over and above what the pricing algorithm and system will determine just to make sure that we're maximizing every possible opportunity that we can in those times of the year. As well as discounting strategies on top of that. So during quieter periods, for example, where we might employ additional discounting strategies over and above what's being pushed through the algorithm itself. So what is dynamic pricing? Dynamic pricing is a very common revenue management strategy, particularly within the travel industry. So it allows for changes in prices based on a range of different factors, and some of those I touched on before that sort of underpin the actual algorithm itself. Commonly also referred to as demand-based pricing, and that's simply because it does react based on demand, I guess, fundamentally. That's essentially what it's trying to do. And it will, pull in all these different factors of the algorithm and also determine based on that location at a certain point in time for a certain date into the future, what the most appropriate price should be. So it can have two effects, I guess. It can increase overall prices when demand is the highest. And on the flip side of that, it can also lower pricing when demand is a bit lower. And just referring to the charts on the right-hand side, you can see a simple example there of a static pricing setup where you might have a single price point at a property. So regardless of what the demand is, if it's very low or very high, the pricing point will remain the same. Therefore, you get very static revenue expectations throughout the year versus what we employ at Hometime, which is a dynamic pricing setup where we have, in this example, we've got 5 different price points, but in reality, it can be significantly more than that. And consequently, you have bonus revenue at either end of the spectrum accordingly based on those different price points. Okay, so the dynamic pricing algorithm itself. So like I mentioned, lots of different factors get pushed into this depending on, what is actually happening within that market. So each of these factors can contribute to varying degrees. And again, that goes back to the customizations that we would define for that particular market. That also determines how much impact each of these factors play within the algorithm itself. So, using seasonality as an example, that's probably the most common one, I guess, where some markets are hugely seasonal, due to weather conditions, for example, or tourism fluctuations versus others which have more of a static year-round demand. So that is a good example of where one market might have more of an impact coming from seasonality versus another one. The very starting point that determines where the algorithm goes begins at our base price. So this is a pretty important price setting that we apply for literally every single property that we manage. It's kind of the fundamental underlying price that all other adjustments are made from. So we as a team, make an assessment on specific properties, what's the most appropriate base price. And we do this in a number of ways. We obviously do a pretty comprehensive analysis initially when we're looking at the property when it first comes on our radar. And we can do that through, external data. We have pretty comprehensive internal data as well across our existing portfolio. And, once we've set those base prices, we do review and update those periodically, over time. So depending on what might be changing in a particular market or, broader long-term trends, for example, or even that particular property's performance can determine where we actually end up adjusting that base price into the future. Seasonality, and you can see the impact there. As an example, this is just an arbitrary example, but where we started with $100 base price, you can see the fluctuations that might potentially apply in a quite a seasonal market in this example, where prices increase up to 32% higher for peak season, and then they might conversely drop 30% lower into the quieter period. So obviously very important for markets where travel demand is hugely seasonal, and there's a couple of good examples of that in Australia, in particular like Northern Territory, northern parts of Queensland, which have obviously weather impacts as well, and the peak periods of travel experience obviously much higher demand than the times outside of that in other parts of the year. So yeah, we apply this into our customization setups accordingly for each market as applicable. The next overlapping layer would be the day of week trends. So again, this can be very specific to different markets. We see, weekends and weekdays can behave very differently. And even within some specific markets, like a CBD area can behave very differently to properties that are, 10 kilometers out from the CBD in regards to different demand factors on different days of the week. So we factor that in accordingly. Most commonly, weekends typically have the highest demand. So as an example, we can see up to potentially 25% increase in occupancy performance in some markets over just the Friday, Saturday nights, for example. And then that potentially also filters out to the shoulder dates. So Thursday and Sunday as well can see increased demand as opposed to the midweek dates. So definitely something that we factor in as well. There's a few different settings that we can apply that can drive this around sort of minimum accepted prices and override prices for specific days of the week, literally down to a Monday or a Tuesday if we want to do that as well. So booking lead time, another really important one. And again, this varies a lot by market. So using the example on the right, you can see potentially the impact that booking lead time might have on specific prices. Using this example, very near-term dates might have a reduction of, X% closer to arrival, and then that might periodically increase further out. So we're trying to capture as much possible revenue for further out dates as we can. Not applicable to every market, but definitely a common setting that we try to maximize as much as possible, just ensuring that we're capturing as much revenue as we can for these far out dates. Potentially up to 20 or 30% higher for, up to 12 months out, for example. And we do obviously get a lot of bookings that far out. So yeah, it makes sense for us to make the most of that where possible. So we do control how much of that applies in each of our customization setups. So another hugely important one, holiday and event pricing. So we get a lot of questions and queries about this. And it's definitely something that our team pays a lot of attention to. We spend a lot of time looking into this, a lot of analysis done. There's obviously a lot of markets and a lot of events within those markets, and each of them come with varying degrees of demand, I guess. So like I mentioned before, our algorithm does adjust prices during these peak periods accordingly. So that is built in by default into our algorithm and our customizations. So we are making sure that we're capturing increased pricing where there is these special events and holiday periods. But we can also, like I mentioned before, make some adjustments over and above that where we think appropriate to capture the most possible revenue over those really ultra peak periods. And we do obviously regularly review those adjustments. We don't sort of set and forget. We make regular reviews if we do have overrides or increases for these particular dates, and then make adjustments as needed, just making sure that we're constantly pricing in accordance with the market as well. And we use obviously a range of data available to us to make those decisions. So we have obviously really comprehensive internal data, as well as lots of good external data providers where we can get that information right down to specific dates. We can see pacing, occupancy levels, inventory, all this type of stuff, which informs our decision making as well.
And you can give a good example of this. Maybe for the homeowner, how they can imagine this happens is, lo and behold, Taylor Swift announces a concert in Melbourne and Sydney, maybe on a Friday night, US time. Most people, I guess, are asleep in beds. All of a sudden, an influx of booking starts to happen, and the software sees this demand start to come through by an increase in booking pace in Melbourne for those dates. And, early in the hours of Saturday morning, the software's already like incremented those prices for Melbourne properties up because it sees that sort of demand. So that's why that dynamics pricing software is important, because it's so reactive to some of the things that, even we can have our finger on the pulse, but if a concert gets announced in the US, we might not have that on our kind of radar. So it does kind of catch all those kind of market responses, which is awesome.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Billy. That's correct. So yeah, great example, right? If we're not obviously awake at particular times when things get announced, it does limit our ability to capture that. But as mentioned, it still gets captured within the algorithm itself, and it's almost instantaneous as well. Like as soon as it registers the pickup in demand over those peak events, it will immediately push up pricing as well. So it works well. Probably using the most common in Melbourne, at least, the most common example of a peak period is the Melbourne Grand Prix. Happens every year, and without fail, every year it has really, really high demand. The dates do shift, so it's not a matter of just predicting, much like Christmas or Easter, where, well, actually Easter shifts as well, but Christmas probably not so much, where, we know the exact date every year. That's not the case with Grand Prix. So it does sort of fluctuate a couple of weeks either side of a rough time period every year. And you can see in this example, how nightly prices might fluctuate based on that particular event. So, the golden line is a particular property's pricing in the lead up to Grand Prix. And then, the 4 or 5 days of the Grand Prix event itself, you can see it spikes up, pretty much 100, 200% from where it was originally. So, and the other shaded areas are reflective of the broader market in Melbourne as well. So whilst we're definitely picking up pricing, you can see that the rest of the market does that as well. The impact of pacing. So I guess pretty similar to a few other things that I've talked about already, but pacing will refer to how many bookings are coming into a particular period of time. So what's the actual booking pace of a particular date? And that's also a good indication of demand, obviously. So if bookings are slowing down for a particular date or a particular time, it obviously is reflective that there's not as much demand at those particular price points, at least on those particular dates. So the algorithm will naturally pick up on that and then adjust prices lower. And then conversely, and similarly to the example Billy just talked about, if we are seeing an increased bookings pace, it generally indicates that there is something actually happening in that market where, people are wanting to travel there. Potentially there's an event on, potentially there's a conference or something like this. So that will, the algorithm will pick up on that as well, seeing increased bookings and then obviously increase the price accordingly. And that's all for the pricing. So I'll hand over to Abs now who can talk through the minimum stay calculations.
Thank you, Dale. Yeah, so similar to, I guess, our kind of pricing algorithm, a pricing tool also kind of helps us have a setup with minimum stay settings, and it's definitely quite dynamic and dependent on what market and what customization we've got. The idea is like, yeah, we're tailoring to specific booking trends and patterns in the market to kind of maximize occupancy between longer and shorter bookings, with the aim, I guess, and we'll talk through some settings, in the next few slides. But yeah, definitely to, as the example set here is like on the side here, that certain peak periods would have potentially longer stays available, and then yet longer bookings available, and that's what we're tailoring towards with these sort of minimum stay settings. So just an example of what we might do across like weekends and weekdays. So typically weekends are high demand periods with, even depending on most markets, but in the future, we generally have a manual override or automatic override for weekends, just to maximize occupancy across kind of periods. And the aim there is potentially to not have a weekend just booked out further out, and try to maximize occupancy there as well. Conversely, if it is a last minute kind of booking that we're trying to chase, we typically lower these for upcoming dates, just to ensure we don't get vacant across these stays. Another aspect of these settings, so far out stays. So similar to last minute stays, we apply kind of a periodic scaled increase to these settings that are progressively like further out. This helps us, and kind of talked to this earlier, but we just don't want those short stays further out and potentially restrict kind of longer bookings that might be 5 to even 30 nights in the future. Different markets obviously have different settings given kind of their booking trends and patterns, and we definitely are able to adjust that across various listings in various markets as well.
Can I jump in there, Abs, and just give an example? Say for a lot of our vacation markets that have some seasonality, let's use like Far North Queensland. Obviously, the peak period is sort of from sort of June, July through to August, each year. We wouldn't necessarily want to be taking bookings 10 months in advance for 2 nights over a weekend, because that's like such a premium time slot on the calendar, and we don't want to just give that up for a 2-night booking. When someone, if we reserve that for a 4 or 5 night booking, someone from Melbourne or Sydney is most likely going to fly up and spend some time with the family, etc., and they're going to spend a lot more money and fill up those shoulder dates on a Thursday, Friday, or a Monday, Tuesday. And that's just like, yeah, exactly what Abs is talking to, which is just ensuring, for these high demand periods, we are reserving calendar availability for the highest value bookings, essentially.
Awesome. Thanks, Billy. And then that leads us to, I guess, the next bit, which is orphan gaps. So interestingly, so this occurs potentially in peak periods as well. So if you've got an example is like, yeah, a 7-night booking restriction and there's basically nights in between kind of dates, which we call orphan gaps. This kind of allows kind of flexibility to take those bookings. So yeah, peak period, say for across kind of using the same example as far North Queensland, if there are a few nights in between, we can definitely try maximize occupancy there with some of these automatic settings in place. So yeah, just orphan gap fillers. And then
can I just talk one more thing there, Abs? Because we have a lot of homeowners that ask us like, hey, I don't want to accept a 2-night booking. Sometimes they feel like those guests are less desirable, say, than someone who's staying for 3-4 nights over a weekend. And I think what's so great about the orphan nights is that, you might have a minimum stay of 3 nights in the calendar, getting these nice long bookings over the weekend. But then you do have 2 or 3 night gaps between every single weekend. And if that you want to take a shorter booking, otherwise those nights just go unsold. And so, you're only offering that reduced minimum stay for that very specific portion of the calendar, right? So it's really, I think from like, thinking about the way guests behave and risk and that kind of stuff, it makes a lot of sense to reduce your minimum stay for those orphan nights. It's basically free incremental kind of revenue for the property, right? Otherwise, they would go unsold. Sorry to jump in.
And definitely, yeah, and I guess across peak periods, the rates are higher. So yeah, I think it's definitely a worthwhile, a setting to have in place and bookings to take, because you are kind of missing out sometimes on quite substantial revenue across the year. So yeah, that's on orphan gaps. And I think next up is market customization. So we touched on this earlier with Dale, and in terms of like the various settings that we can put in place. So our market customizations, they're set up, as much as 10 to 15 different customizations per market, which depending on unique elements. So potentially like location of certain properties. So one example actually we do have is in Melbourne. So we completely segregate CBD and non-CBD properties, because they definitely have different patterns in terms of like bookings, probably more heavy weekend bookings in the city. So we've got a various amount of settings that we can put in place. On the right are some examples, but potentially it's a higher price on the weekend automatically. And then, even there's different kind of settings within the algorithm that you can have. So, toggling between demand factor and seasonality, so that adds on percentages to the increase in terms of increasing prices, and then even just around like what should we be comparing ourselves to in terms of pricing. So whether that's hotels or even just standard like short-term rentals as well. So just a few settings that we can put in place just to kind of maximize and toggle between kind of different markets as well.
Just to kind of, as we move to the end of the session, like we have a customer experience team that's on hand, 5 days a week or 6 days a week to answer any of these kind of queries. So, and they're based on the Gold Coast. And so call, Corin, Amanda, Rose, Joyce, or Danny. Just get in touch. If you have any of these questions, we're happy to have that conversation. And often, owners have great ideas and suggestions to improve their property, and we're happy to hear those as well. As I said, it really is kind of like a partnership. We're trying to sweat the asset as much as possible. So let's work together to get those kind of results. And I think that draws us to a close. So as we kind of do more of these video series, the idea is that we get your feedback and we answer, these questions that are in, our customer cohort. So we'd love to hear your feedback about this particular session, and if you have any other questions. And we hope to bring you, more videos in the near future, highlighting different aspects of Hometime and shedding light on the internal machinery of our business. Thanks for watching. Thanks on behalf of Abs and Dale. And we look forward to, tweaking the settings of your property and maximizing the returns until next time. Thank you.